When it comes to storytelling, there's a point where something stops being a matter of interpretation and starts becoming a question of consistency, not in the sense of whether you enjoy a scene or connect with it emotionally, but in how well the story holds together once you begin looking at the decisions being made within it, and whether those decisions actually align with the world and the characters the story has already established. That idea has been on my mind a bit more after my last video on Rossi's story. The response ended up being far more divided than I expected. Some people immediately recognized the issue I was pointing out, while others disagreed with it entirely, often approaching the same situation from a completely different angle, and going through those comments made one thing stand out very clearly. The disagreement wasn't just about the conclusion, it was about how the situation itself was being understood. So before going any further, it makes sense to step back for a moment and lay the situation out again, just to keep everything grounded in the same context. In Rossi's story, a potentially dangerous sample ends up in the hands of children, while at the same time there are hostile forces actively trying to retrieve it, turning the scenario into something that carries real risk rather than a purely theoretical threat. Despite that, the decision is made not to secure it immediately, choosing instead to let the situation continue and unfold on its own terms, rather than resolving it at the point where the risk is already clear. That's the core of it. In my previous video, I went into why that situation didn't work for me, both in terms of how the plot handles it and how the characters respond within it. What stood out afterward wasn't just the disagreement itself, but the way many of the responses approached the situation, often focusing on justifying it through different angles, whether that meant treating in the sample as less dangerous than it appears, assuming the characters remain in control throughout, or reading the story as if it clearly signals that everything is ultimately safe. That shift in perspective is where the discussion starts to open up. At that point, it moves beyond a single scene and into something broader, touching on how risk is interpreted, how character decisions are evaluated, and more generally, what people are willing to accept within a story before it begins to feel inconsistent. This is also where I think the conversation becomes more interesting, since the disagreement isn't simply about whether the scene works or not, but about the framework being used to judge it in the first place. So rather than repeating the same argument, the goal here is to take a step back and approach this from a wider angle, starting with this specific situation, while also expanding into a larger discussion about storytelling, especially in this space where these kinds of inconsistencies tend to appear more often than they initially seem. They don't always stand out immediately, they don't always break the experience on the surface. Over time though, they still shape how the story holds together. Before going deeper into Rossi's story and explaining why I ultimately call it a bad one, it's worth stepping back for a moment and looking at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about a single story or a single scene. This kind of issue shows up a lot more often than people think, especially in gacha storytelling, where inconsistencies tend to slip in far more frequently than they should. So the question becomes, what exactly are we talking about when we say inconsistencies? At the basic level, it sounds obvious, almost trivial, but it matters more than people give it credit for. An inconsistency is any point where the story contradicts itself, whether that's through its logic, its characters, its timeline, or the rules of its world, and once that happens, even in small ways, it starts to weaken the structure holding everything together. And yes, that is a problem. Not subjectively, structurally, because there are different forms this can take. You have plot holes and logical inconsistencies, where events don't line up the way they should. You have character inconsistencies, where actions don't match what we know about the character. You have timeline issues, world building contradictions. All of these fall under the same umbrella, and all of them chip away at the same thing: immersion. The moment those cracks start to show, the story stops feeling like something you're experiencing and starts feeling like something you're analyzing from the outside. You're no longer inside the narrative, you're questioning it. And that's exactly why the argument that the plot wasn't the point, so it doesn't matter, doesn't really hold up. Even if a story is aiming for something emotional or thematic or character driven, it still needs a stable foundation. Otherwise, those emotional moments don't land the way they're supposed to. They feel forced, or incomplete, or just slightly off in a way that's hard to ignore once you notice it. Character consistency plays a big role in this as well. When a character acts in a way that doesn't align with their established behavior, it doesn't just create confusion, it undermines the credibility of their development. You start questioning whether their actions are driven by who they are or by what the plot needs them to do. While there are cases where ambiguity is intentional, where stories play with unreliable narrators or surreal structures, that's not really what we're dealing with here. Gacha storytelling, for the most part, doesn't operate on that level. It's not designed around that kind of narrative ambiguity, which is why these inconsistencies stand out even more when they happen. To make this clearer, let's step outside of Endfield for a moment and look at a more concrete example, because this isn't isolated. If you look at a game like Nikke, inconsistencies are almost built into certain parts of its storytelling, especially in side stories, character episodes, or collaboration events. A lot of that ties back to how the protagonist is handled. The main character in Nikke is very much a self-insert. In many of these stories, they don't actively drive the narrative, they're just present, which creates a strange situation where the story would function almost the same way even if they weren't there at all. That alone introduces a form of inconsistency. Now, if we take one of the more recent examples, the collaboration event with Licorice Recoil, the issue becomes even more apparent. There's an entire storyline built around an orphanage where children are being trained as assassins. It's treated as a serious situation, something that carries weight, something that should matter. And yet, the protagonist has the kind of authority and connections that could realistically resolve the entire situation with a single call. But they don't. They just go along with it. At that point, you're dealing with more than one type of inconsistency at the same time. From a character standpoint, it doesn't make sense for someone in that position to act so passively. From a world building perspective, it raises even bigger questions, because no matter what influence the orphanage director supposedly has, it's extremely hard to believe that those connections outweigh the protagonist's own ties to the government. The scale simply doesn't match. And then you have moments like the protagonist struggling against a group of children, trained or not, which creates yet another disconnect, because it clashes with everything we've been told about their own training and capabilities. Individually, you might overlook one of these things, but when they start stacking together, the illusion breaks. The same kind of issue shows up, even if less frequently, in the main story as well. Take Red Hood and Rappi's arc for example. On the surface, it's framed as an emotional farewell, something meant to hit hard and leave an impact. And in isolation, parts of it do work, but once you start looking a little closer, the foundation underneath that emotional moment starts to feel shaky, because no one actually attempts to resolve the situation. Everyone just accepts that it can be done. That's where the disconnect happens, not because the outcome itself is wrong, but because the process leading to it feels incomplete. There's no real attempt, no meaningful effort to change the situation, no moment where the characters actually push against it before accepting it. Even something as simple as trying and falling would have strengthened that emotional payoff. Instead, it feels like the conclusion is reached too easily, and because of that, the weight of the moment doesn't land the way it should. You start asking a very simple question: do these characters actually care? And once that question is there, it's hard to fully engage with what the story is trying to make you feel. So when people say that inconsistencies don't matter because they weren't the point of the story, this is exactly why they do. Even if the intention is emotional, even if the focus is character growth, even if the themes themselves are solid, if the structure underneath doesn't hold, everything built on top of it starts to lose its impact. Once you start looking at storytelling through that lens, it becomes easier to see why certain scenes feel off, even when they seem to work on the surface. That brings us back to Rossi's story. Everything discussed so far, consistency, character behavior, internal logic, converges here, since this is exactly where the situation begins to lose its footing, and where many of the counter-arguments surrounding it start to feel less convincing when examined more closely. At its core, the setup remains straightforward. A dangerous sample ends up in the hands of children, while external forces are actively trying to retrieve it, turning the situation into something that carries immediate and tangible risk. Under those conditions, the expected response is clear: you secure the threat. Instead, the story allows the situation to continue. The characters step back, choosing to follow the unfolding events rather than resolve them at the point where intervention would make the most sense. Everything that follows builds on that decision. One of the more common responses to this is the idea that the sample is contained, which would imply that the danger isn't as significant as it appears. Looking at it more carefully, that interpretation doesn't really address the underlying issue. Containment doesn't remove risk, it only delays its consequences. A controlled environment is only effective as long as it remains controlled, and placing something potentially dangerous in an unstable context, especially in the hands of children, undermines that condition immediately. At that point, treating the situation as manageable becomes difficult to justify. Another line of reasoning focuses on the protagonist's capability. The assumption that even if things escalate, they can step in and handle it, which would reduce the perceived severity of their risk. That perspective shifts attention away from the decision itself. The question isn't whether the situation can be resolved later, it's why it's allowed to reach that stage at all. There's also the practical limitation to that assumption. The protagonist isn't present at all times, which introduces gaps where no immediate response is possible. If something were to go wrong during those moments, the safety people rely on simply wouldn't be there. Under those circumstances, the decision starts to feel less like a calculated risk and more like a necessary condition for the story to maintain its setup. That leads directly into a broader issue. The situation doesn't just exist on its own, it reflects the characters who allow it to continue. Given how these characters have been established, a passive approach doesn't align with their role or their level of awareness. Taking control of the situation would be the more consistent response, yet that option is never fully pursued. As a result, the lack of action doesn't read as a meaningful choice, it feels misaligned. Once that disconnect is in place, everything that follows becomes harder to engage with. Emotional moments, character interactions, and narrative tension all depend on that initial decision holding up, and when it doesn't, the impact of those elements begin to weaken. The same applies to the idea that the story provides enough signals to indicate that everything is ultimately safe. Even if those signals are present, the setup itself establishes a level of risk that contradicts that reassurance. Presenting something as a threat while expecting it to be perceived as harmless creates a tension that isn't fully resolved. That tension lingers. A similar issue appears in the argument that the situation wasn't meant to be the focus of the story. Even when the emphasis is placed on Rossi's emotional journey or on exploring her character from a different angle, those elements still exist within a structured narrative. They rely on the decisions surrounding them to feel grounded and coherent. When those decisions don't align with the characters or the world they inhabit, the emotional payoff attached to them becomes less effective. Looking at it from that perspective, the issue extends beyond a single scene or a minor detail. It affects how the story functions as a whole. Once the internal logic begins to feel unstable, the experience shifts, and the tension moves away from the story itself toward the mechanics behind it. At that point, immersion breaks, and once that happens, it's difficult to fully return to the narrative in the same way. If we shift the focus away from the situation itself and look more closely at the characters involved, the issue starts to take on a different shape, one that's harder to dismiss as a simple oversight or a matter of interpretation. The story ultimately moves through the decisions its characters make, and the moment those decisions stop aligning with what has been established about them, their judgment, their priorities, their understanding of risk, that's when the foundation begins to weaken. Even if everything else on the surface still appears to function, within Rossi's story, that misalignment becomes noticeable through the way responsibility is handled. The protagonist is not written as someone careless or unaware, quite the opposite. They are presented as capable, experienced, and fully able to recognize the implications of a situation like this. Given that, the choice to step back instead of stepping in doesn't read as hesitation or internal conflict, it reads as a gap between what the character should logically do and what the story allows them to do. That gap is where the inconsistency forms. Once a character action begins to reflect the need of the scenario rather than their own established reasoning, the sense of authenticity starts to slip, and it becomes easier to see the structure behind the scene instead of the character within it. What makes this more apparent is that the pattern doesn't stop at a single decision. Other characters who are aware of the situation follow a similar path, responding with a level of passivity that doesn't quite match their roles or the context they are placed in. The expected reaction, taking control, reducing risk, acting decisively, never fully materializes, and the absence of that response gradually becomes more noticeable the longer the situation is allowed to continue. At that point, the behavior no longer feels like a deliberate trait or a meaningful flaw, it feels constrained. That distinction carries weight, since there is a meaningful difference between a character acting against better judgment as a part of their development and a character acting that way simply to preserve the structure of the scene. In the first case, the story acknowledges the choice, explores it, and allows it to shape the character moving forward. In the second, the choice exists without that level of attention, which makes it feel less like an intentional narrative decision and more like a necessary compromise. Looking at Rossi's story throughout that lens, the decisions being made don't seem to carry the narrative focus they would need in order to feel intentional. There is no real emphasis on the weight of those choices, no exploration of why they are being made despite the risk involved, and no meaningful pushback from the story itself. As a result, the actions come across less as defining moments and more as steps required to keep the situation in place. That shift affects more than just characterization. Once the connection between character and action becomes unstable, everything built on top of it begins to feel less grounded. Emotional moments lose some of their impact, not because the intent behind them is weak, but because the path leading to them doesn't fully support the outcome. The audience is left navigating two layers at once, the story being presented and the underlying logic that doesn't quite align with it. And when that happens, engagement changes. Instead of following the character's experience, attention moves toward evaluating the decisions themselves, trying to reconcile what is happening with what should be happening, given everything that has already been established. That tension doesn't come from complexity, it comes from inconsistency, which is why this aspect matters as much as it does, since it's not limited to whether a single decision works in isolation, but extends to whether it fits the character making it, within the context that has already been defined. Once that alignment starts to slip even slightly, the effect compounds over time, and the story begins to lose cohesion in ways that are difficult to ignore, even if everything else around it is trying to hold together. At this point, the more interesting question isn't just why these inconsistencies exist, but why they are so often accepted or at least overlooked, even when they are fairly visible once pointed out. Part of that comes down to how people engage with stories in the first place, since not everyone approaches them with the same focus or expectations. For a lot of viewers, the primary connection to a story is emotional rather than structural. If a scene feels impactful, if a character moment resonates, or if the overall experience is enjoyable, then the underlying mechanics tend to fade into the background, even when they don't fully hold up under closer examination. That kind of engagement is valid, it just operates on a different level. From that perspective, a situation doesn't necessarily need to be perfectly consistent as long as it delivers on what the audience is looking for it in that moment, whether that's tension, character interaction, or emotional payoff. The structure is still there, but it isn't the main point of focus, so the flaws within it don't stand out as much. There's also the factor of familiarity, especially in gacha storytelling, where certain patterns appear often enough that they start to feel normal. When similar kinds of inconsistencies show up repeatedly across different stories, situations being prolonged for the sake of the narrative, characters stepping back when they realistically wouldn't, conflict being maintained longer than they logically should, those elements stop feeling unusual. They become part of the expected rhythm. Once that happens, the audience adjusts to it. What would otherwise stand out as a contradiction begins to register as just another storytelling choice, something that doesn't necessarily need to be questioned unless it becomes too disruptive to ignore. Another layer to this comes from interpretation. When a story leaves room for explanation, even unintentionally, people tend to fill in those gaps on their own, constructing reasoning that aligns with how they experience the scene. That can take the form of assuming the situation is safer than it appears, or that the characters have knowledge the audience isn't fully aware of, or simply that things are under control even if that control isn't clearly shown. Those interpretations help maintain immersion. They smooth over the rough edges. At the same time, they also move the responsibility away from the story itself and onto the audience, which changes how those inconsistencies are perceived. Instead of being seen as structural issues, they become something that can be rationalized, explained, or reframed depending on how much the viewer is willing to accept. That's where the divide usually happens. Some people focus on what the story presents and evaluate it based on how well it holds together internally. Others focus on what the story is trying to deliver and are more willing to bridge the gaps if the overall experience works for them. Neither approach is inherently wrong, they just lead to very different conclusions. In a case like Rossi's story, that difference becomes especially noticeable since the emotional and thematic elements can still land for some viewers, even if the structure underneath them doesn't fully support those moments. From one angle, the story works, from another, it doesn't hold up. That contrast explains why the response ends up being so divided, and why the same scene can be read in completely different ways depending on what each viewer is prioritizing. At the same time, recognizing that difference doesn't change the underlying issue. A story can still be enjoyable while having structural problems. It can still resonate emotionally while containing inconsistencies that weaken how it holds together as a whole. Those two things can exist at the same time. And that's really the key point here, since acknowledging why people defend these moments doesn't mean those inconsistencies stop mattering. It simply explains why they're easier to overlook. Once you start looking at the structure more closely though, they're much harder to ignore. When we take all of this together, the way the situation is set up, the decisions the characters make within it, and the inconsistencies that start to appear once you look a little closer, it becomes much easier to understand why this story doesn't fully work for me. It's not about a single moment, it's not about one scene that could have been handled slightly better. It's about the way everything connects. The structure that supports the story isn't as stable as it needs to be, and once that starts to slip, every part that relies on it, character decisions, emotional moments, thematic weight, loses some of its impact, even if the intention behind those elements is still there. That's why I don't really see this as something minor or easy to overlook. Even when a story is trying to focus on something else, even when the main goal is emotional or character driven, the foundation still matters, since that's what allows everything else to land the way it's supposed to. Without that, the experience changes. You're no longer fully inside the story. Part of your attention shifts elsewhere, towards the decision being made, towards the logic behind them, towards whether everything actually holds together. And once that shift happens, it's difficult to go back. That's also why I wanted to expand this discussion beyond Rossi's story itself, since this isn't an isolated case. These kinds of inconsistencies show up in different forms across a lot of stories in this space, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that have a much bigger impact on how the narrative feels as a whole. Recognizing them doesn't mean you can't enjoy the story, it doesn't mean the story has no value. What it does mean is that you start seeing it more clearly. You understand why certain moments don't land the way they could have, why some decisions feel off even if you can't immediately explain it, and why the overall experience might feel slightly weaker than it should even when a lot of the individual pieces seem to work. At that point, it becomes less about whether you liked the story or not, and more about how well it actually holds together. That's where my perspective comes from. If the structure isn't there, then everything built on top of it starts to lose stability, and that's ultimately why I call this a bad story, not because it had nothing going for it, but because the foundation it relies on doesn't support what it's trying to do. And that's something I think it's worth paying attention to, especially as this kind of stories continue to evolve. Curious to hear how you see it, especially if you disagree with the original video or even with this one, since I think this is one of those cases where the way you approach storytelling changes the conclusion you end up with. So if you have a different perspective on this, feel free to share it. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, since a lot of you watching are not subscribed, so that would help a lot. And if you enjoy this kind of breakdown, there's more coming because I want to keep exploring this kind of topics a bit further.